So as Russia is continuing their ongoing invasion of Ukraine, Facebook, or I guess Meta now, has made some pretty dramatic changes towards their policy on direct threats of violence. So here from Al Jazeera, they say Facebook is going to be allowing posts that urge violence against invading Russians. So a little bit of details here. They say Meta Platforms, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, has temporarily eased its policy on violent speech following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying that it will allow statements such as death to Russian invaders, but not credible threats against civilians. So first off, obviously, yeah, nobody should ever be able to call for direct threats against civilian populations. That should be, that should be pretty obvious. But as far as like calling for the deaths of Russian invaders, on the one hand, you kind of understand why people are so angry at a violent imperial force that is, invading and occupying a country that doesn't belong to them, that they've been bombing civilians and civilian infrastructure, etc. So you understand why people would be mad enough to want to call for the death to these Russian invaders, as they are calling them. But, in the broader picture of things, I don't think that any Americans who would be in favor of this policy towards Russia would be accepting of the alternative, which is the double standard of how we interpret what Russia is doing right now versus how we would interpret it if the shoe was on the other foot and it had been, let's say, Afghani or Iraqi civilians having the ability to openly call for the death of George W. Bush for illegally invading Iraq, or calling openly for the deaths of American troops. And certainly it would not be the case that Americans would support, let's say, Palestinians who are suffering under an ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing and consistent bombarding of, let's say, the Gaza Strip and brazen war crimes. Americans would never be accepting of Palestinian people who are trying to liberate themselves from this occupying force. They would never be accepting of them openly calling for the deaths of Israeli politicians or for the deaths of IDF soldiers who are directly threatening them. I mean, this is just a clear example of a double standard of a private corporation that is based here in the United States that is basically just picking and choosing which conflicts it wants to, have a side on. And so, it's just, in that sense, it's completely ridiculous because you see the double standard, right? If they had a clean policy that said, anybody is allowed to call for harm or the deaths of any army or military in the world, then that would be one thing. That would be consistent. Or you just ban it altogether. But having this, pick and choose different conflicts and, have preferential treatment for American soldiers invading Iraq versus Russian soldiers invading Ukraine, that just doesn't really make any sense at all. And we've seen some pretty glaring examples of this hypocrisy that they're going to give in this article. But a little bit more details. They say Meta's statement followed a report by Reuters that said that the policy applies only to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Estonia, Georgia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Russia, Slovakia, and Ukraine. So basically just Eastern Europe and Russia, citing the firm's emails to its content moderators. But the firm did not reply to a request seeking confirmation of the policy's geographic boundaries. So kind of unclear exactly how this policy is going to be looking. But even if it is isolated to Eastern Ukraine or to Eastern Europe, I mean, it's effectively the same argument here that's being made. But they continue saying that Meta, which counts billions of users globally across its platforms, has previously struggled with what it would allow people to post in moments of upheaval. And they say in July 2021, the firm temporarily allowed posts calling for death to the Ayatollah Khamenei, referring to Iran's supreme leader Ali Husseini Khamenei, during the protests that rocked the country. And they say tech platforms have had to navigate a slew of thorny issues relating to the war in Ukraine, such as when U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham called for the assassination of Russian President Vladimir Putin in a televised interview and on Twitter. And he said, quote, "Remember, the only way that this ends is for somebody in Russia to take this guy out," says Graham's tweet from March 3rd, which Twitter has not taken down. So again, I covered this Lindsey Graham statement on my channel as well as the interview that he gave. But, whether or not you want to say that this should be banned from Twitter, I think is a conversation that you could have. But it's definitely not debatable that a sitting U.S. senator should not be fucking calling for the assassination of another nuclear-armed leader on the world stage, as we are right now in the middle of the most heated and tense moment that we've seen since World War II in potentially escalating towards a nuclear confrontation between the U.S. or NATO and Russia. So, obviously an idiotic and insane thing to say at a moment like this. But in the broader picture of things, again, this is not the only example that we've seen from U.S. officials basically doing, direct threats of either terrorism or violence against other countries. We also had this under the Trump administration, if you guys remember. Trump says that he'll target Iran's cultural sites. cultural sites. In other words, terrorism. Okay, so just a little bit of details and reminder on that. They say Iran's cultural heritage is suddenly a topic of urgent global interest after President Trump threatened to strike such sites if the country retaliates for the U.S. killing of General Qasem Soleimani last week. And they say in a series of tweets Saturday evening, Trump wrote that if Iran strikes any Americans or American assets, the U.S. has targeted 52 Iranian sites, some at very high level and important to Iran and the Iranian culture, and those targets and Iran itself will be hit very fast and very hard. So again, we're talking about Donald Trump, okay? Clearly an unhinged person who doesn't really have many ideological positions and just likes to, puff out his chest and act like a big tough guy in moments like this. But I mean, look at the context, okay? This was after we had just illegally assassinated Qasem Soleimani, one of the top Iranian generals. It would be the equivalent of Iran, using a drone to assassinate Mike Pence while he's on a trip to Canada. And after we did that, after we escalated tensions with Iran, almost popping off into a war between the US and Iran, okay, after that, and after we initiated this escalation, Trump then threatens their cultural sites, okay? A direct open threat online on Twitter, okay, openly calling for terrorism against another country. So again, the double standards here, right? I don't think that he was banned from Twitter from this. Eventually, obviously he's not on Twitter right now, but that was for an entirely different thing, which again kind of points out the hypocrisy and the double standards of a lot of this stuff, right? That's a ban from Twitter, which is obviously not the same as Facebook, and they have slightly different standards and everything. But I mean, Donald Trump was not banned for calling openly for terrorism against another country, but he did end up getting banned off of Twitter for initiating the January 6th riots and insurrection, if you want to call it that, at the Capitol building. So an attack on the Capitol building, which is somehow, worse, or somehow worse by Twitter standards at least, than directly calling for terrorism against another country. Again, I don't really know what the fuck the standards are. The lesson here is that maybe we should not be allowing private, capitalist, profit-driven corporations to decide and pick and choose whatever they want to allow on their sites without barely any oversight whatsoever. So again, that's kind of the lesson. Some more important context to basically remind you guys of what is going on right now, in the same way that I don't think that it's beneficial to call for the deaths of, either Russian invaders, as they were calling them, or Ukrainian soldiers, or really any soldiers on either side. Again, we should be pushing for diplomacy right now. And a part of that is that, a lot of these Russian troops that have been captured, or a lot of these Russian troops that have spoken out since this war began, a lot of them don't even know what the fuck they're even going into Ukraine for, right? They've been lied to. They've been misled to believe that this is a campaign of liberation, and that the Ukrainian government actually is just entirely run by Nazis, and that they will be welcomed as they go into this country, right? Kind of similar to what American troops were told going into Iraq. So, a lot of these people, first of all, on the Russian side, don't even know why the fuck they're going into Ukraine in the first place. Also, a lot of them are just like young fucking teenagers who are just being thrown into this war as collateral for Putin. So again, you kind of got to understand that context a little bit. And in addition to that, the context of just this rampant, Russophobia, if you want to call it that, against Russians who have absolutely nothing to do with the war. And so, I think there is a fair question of what exactly is this type of a policy shift going to do to escalate the tensions we have seen towards innocent Russians. And so, just as a reminder, they say Russian businesses in the U.S. face threats and vandalism over the invasion. I've even seen like some Ukrainian places that have like Russian sounding words associated with them, like restaurants in New York City that have been attacked as people think that they're Russian, and then it turns out they're actually owned by Ukrainian citizens. So, again, it's completely ridiculous, because neither of those should be acceptable in any way, shape, or form. But also we had this: 10 states have banned Russian vodka, a symbolic gesture with little economic punch. And we also had just stupid shit like this: International Cat Federation bans Russian cats from competition. So again, it's just, at this point, it seems like there's a complete overreaction in many ways towards trying to punish innocent Russian civilians with the broad sanctions that we have been deploying, with the Russian oil ban, etc., completely isolating them from the global financial system. So, I think that there are a lot of problems with our overly broad sanctions, but on top of that, just absolutely insane Russophobia, xenophobia, whatever you want to call it, with just shit like that. U.S., Russians who have absolutely nothing to do or no control over what Vladimir Putin is deciding to do right now, them getting attacked attacked somehow or being held accountable. And I just want to remind you guys, yes, it's perfectly fine and just to be angry and righteous about, what Vladimir Putin is doing right now, right? Everybody should be condemning him. That's pretty fucking easy. He is a violent imperialist who is committing brazen war crimes right now. That should be the easy part. The harder part is trying to tamp back our response to what is happening right now in a level-headed way. That's what nobody wants to talk about. That's what nobody wants to acknowledge right now. I mean, the fact is, if Americans were held accountable with financial sanctions from the global community, or with bans on our exports, or with whatever sanctions that they may be, if Americans were held accountable to the same degree that Russians are being held accountable right now for invading Ukraine, if Americans were held accountable for, let's say, the actions of George W. Bush for invading Iraq, then you wouldn't see a single U.S. product on any shelves around the world right now. Okay, so you got to understand this, put it in context, and try to think about the double standards and the situation if it was on the other foot. So again, just kind of insane policy, in my opinion. If you're going to allow for threats against even troops in this case, then make it even across the board. Allow Palestinians to call for the deaths of IDF soldiers. Allow Iraqi and Afghani civilians to call for the deaths of American soldiers. You kind of got to be consistent about it at the very least.